He was still in government, serving as Truman's Secretary of Commerce. Yet he was contradicting Truman's foreign policy. 8 days later, he was out of a job. Despite all this, Humphrey, the inveterate optimist, still believed that when he sat down with Wallace, they would see eye to eye. When they finally did at Wallace's hotel that night, he explained what was happening in Minnesota and pleaded for Wallace's help in taking the party back. Wallace seemed puzzled by the talk of communist treachery. After all, he explained, he knew only one communist himself. Humphrey was stunned. Several open communists had driven Wallace from the airport. Liberalism was headed for civil war, and the man he once idolized would be on the other side. But in the fall of 1946, that civil war was still months away, and Wallace was still a liberal icon. Shortly after his firing, the American left gathered in Chicago to defend their hero, denounce the growing Cold War, and mobilize for November's midterm elections. All the biggest liberal groups were there: the National Citizens Political Action Committee, the Independent Citizens Committee, the NAACP, and the Congress of International Organizations, CIO, for what historian Alonzo Hamby has called one of the widest and most representative assemblies of liberals ever brought together. Liberals left Chicago giddy at their show of strength and confident about the fall campaign. In mid-October, CIO President Philip Murray, the left's most influential labor leader, predicted that we expect this movement to become in due course the most powerful liberal and progressive organization brought together in the history of the country. Richard Nixon knew better. In September 1945, the 32-year-old Navy lieutenant commander received a letter from a prominent banker back home in Whittier, California. The letter asked if he would like to be a candidate for Congress on the Republican ticket in 1946. Nixon quickly agreed. The district, California's 12th, was represented by a 5-term liberal Democrat named Jerry Voorhees. Voorhees was hardly a Soviet apologist, but he did have ties to the National Citizens Political Action Committee and the CIO, and for Nixon, that was enough. Fusing the two organizations under the sinister rubric, the PAC, he made their supposed support of Voorhees the centerpiece of his campaign. Nixon wasn't unique. Across the country, conservative Republicans attacked liberal Democrats as soft on inflation, labor militancy, and perhaps most damaging of all, communism, charging that a group of alien-minded radicals had seized the Democratic Party. Tennessee Congressman B. Carroll Reese called the election a fight basically between communism and republicanism. 2 months before the election, New York Herald Tribune columnists Joseph and Stuart Alsop saw the disaster about to unfold. Liberals, they charged, had consistently avoided the great political reality of the present, the Soviet challenge to the West. As a result, in the spasm of terror which will seize this country, it is the right, the very extreme right, which is most likely to gain victory. The election was a massacre. Republicans gained an astonishing 13 seats in the Senate and 55 in the House, taking control of both chambers for the first time in 16 years. Nixon cruised to victory. "Bow your heads," wrote TRB, the New Republic's political columnist. "Conservatism has hit America." Only one liberal faction was not implicated in the 1946 disaster, and it was barely a faction at all. America's 4 largest liberal organizations may have admitted communists, but a 5th, the Union for Democratic Action, UDA, did not. Founded in 1941 by former socialists who favored the United States entry into World War II, the UDA was small, perpetually broke, and widely reviled for its refusal to admit communists. With few active chapters and a mere 5,000 members, it was, admitted National Director James Loeb, the pariah of the liberal movement. The UDA had already been planning a conference for early 1947, but the conservative landslide gave it new urgency and new appeal. And so, on Saturday, January 4th, 1947, an unexpectedly large crowd showed up at Washington's stately Willard Hotel. Humphrey was there. So was Michigan's Walter Reuther, the ascetic, hard-driving 39-year-old who had seized control of the United Auto Workers the previous spring. From Harvard came Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., not yet 30 and already in possession of a Pulitzer Prize for his history of Jacksonian America. Eleanor Roosevelt, who had grown to loathe the Soviets during her human rights work at the UN, gave the conference its New Deal bona fides. And Reinhold Niebuhr, the tall, unaffected Midwesterner widely acknowledged to be America's leading Protestant theologian, provided the theoretical heft. In the famed hotel where Abraham Lincoln spent the night before his first inaugural, they altered American history, renaming their organization Americans for Democratic Action, ADA. The men and women of the Willard committed themselves to a new liberalism. On domestic policy, its principles were familiar: the defense of civil liberties and the expansion of the New Deal. But on foreign policy, the ADA broke ranks, declaring its opposition to communism overseas and its refusal to cooperate with communists at home. At the heart of the ADA's new liberalism was a term that had only recently entered the American lexicon: totalitarianism. Most liberals loathed fascism, but many saw communism as something different, a noble dream, if flawed in practice, and a powerful ally in the fight against imperialism abroad and for economic justice at home. For the ADA, however, fascism and communism were both totalitarian ideologies. They both sought to utterly control society, smashing all independent sources of authority in pursuit of the unlimited domination and degradation and eventual obliteration of the individual. They both threatened the principles liberalism held most dear. Many on the left greeted the ADA's founding with scorn. The CIO deplored the division in the liberal movement. Wallace, who since leaving the Truman administration had become editor of the New Republic, penned a column titled, "The Enemy is Not Each Other." But they were missing the ADA's essential point. For the new liberals, the enemy was each other. Critics accused the new organization of undermining liberal unity against the right, and the ADA replied that communists actually hindered that effort by discrediting liberals. But more fundamentally, they argued that liberalism had an enemy that was not on the right. Liberalism, in Schlesinger's phrase, stood in the vital center between the two great totalitarian poles of communism and fascism. To define it merely as conservatism's antithesis was to deny liberalism's full moral identity. Over the next decade and a half, this anti-totalitarian liberalism would become the dominant ideology in American public life. It would spend its first years engulfed in a civil war on the left, only to be thrown on the defensive for much of the 1950s by an emerging Cold War right. But it would survive these challenges, and as a new decade began and a new spirit took hold, it finally began to realize the vision of national greatness born at the Willard Hotel. As liberalism was being reborn, so it seemed, was the world itself. On February 21, 1947, a British embassy official drove to the State Department, where he informed Under-Secretary of State Dean Acheson that His Majesty's government, itself under desperate economic strain, could no longer continue aiding the besieged governments of Greece and Turkey. For more than a century, Britain had been the greatest power on earth. Now, as one State Department official put it, Great Britain had within the hour handed the job of world leadership, with all its burdens and all its glory, to the United States. The Greek monarchy was hardly an ideal supplicant. Under assault from communist rebels backed by the new Soviet bloc, it was not merely authoritarian, but chaotic as well. Next door, the Turkish government was 3 years away from its first free election. But for Truman, imperfect democracies were vastly superior to totalitarianism. And at 1 p.m. on March 12th, in a speech carried live on radio, he called on Congress to provide economic and military aid. At the present moment in world history, he declared, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority, forcibly imposed upon the majority. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. It was the right policy, clothed in a doctrine that was both stirring